Thanks for joining. We understand that this is the last session between you and cold beer and magic, or, well, one and the same. So with that, I'd like to introduce my friend who is Laura Richardson. She is the VP of Sales at Contenio. And we've all been in this situation where we work with cross-functional teams in a project scenario, and it's really tough to get things done without team collaboration. So Laura's going to talk to you about how to do that effectively.
Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. Yay! Make a lot of noise. So I'm probably going to walk around a little bit. I'm realizing as I stand up here and look at you all that I can't see anything. Those lights are really bright. So if it looks like I'm making eye contact, I'm probably not. But really quick, I just want to get a sense of who's here before I talk a little bit about myself. How many of you are in sales? Would you say it's sales role? A couple over here. What about marketing? Couple marketing. Engineering? You're not engineering if you're sales too. Yeah. Okay, engineering, product management. Anything I didn't say that, operations? Okay, all right, so let me tell you a little bit about myself, kind of in the context of the company. So we're small enough where I wear almost every one of those hats. So I feel like I can have empathy with all of you. And engineering people, my engineers won't let me code, but they certainly have to work with me a lot. So I think we could have a kind of offline, interesting conversation about just about anything, just because we're small, right? So what Contenio does is helps teams of all of these different kind of functional roles collaborate more effectively together so that they get things done faster and with more buy-in and more alignment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go, but that's what Contenio is up to. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you is that I'm part of the Every Voice Engaged Foundation as well. Now, the leadership of Contenio built this nonprofit organization, and some of the pictures that you see here we're really proud of them because we end up applying a lot of these collaboration methods and tools for collaboration. We apply them to the civic sector as well. So how do you make a company function better? How do you engage with employees? It turns out it's the exact same recipe in terms of how you engage with citizens or residents or members of any particular community, big or small, right? We work with individual schools, school districts, cities, and there are even some programs going on in Europe that are a little bit broader than a particular city. So it's really fun to be able to say, hey, I can make my community better in the same way that I help my customers be better at collaboration. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is what is collaboration? What do I mean by that? There's a couple distinctions that I think are valuable. I don't want to kill you with definitions, but if we kind of all have a shared understanding, I think the rest of what I'm going to talk about is going to make a little bit more sense. I'm going to give you a tool. When you walk away from here, what I want you to get out of this is like, oh, I can do that with my team. I'm going to try that. So it would be super awesome and make me really happy if everybody in here decided that, yes, I'm going to try it. Right? And I'll give you a couple ideas about how you might want to do it in a low-risk way. If you're really gutsy, I can give you like, hey, here's a big way of doing it, but let's try this when we're done. And then I'm going to tell you about how we use this at Contenio. And the reason I like this example is I can talk about it freely. I don't have to worry about IP. But it's also, we have a very cross-functional team that is kind of a good example with this with the Kettering Foundation. So it'll give you a real taste of this. We're small enough, whereas especially as we get into this how-to and my case study, just wave your hands. I can almost see you there. Now I can see you, great. And I'm happy to take questions as we go. All right, so these are things that I care about a lot, right? These are the kinds of problems, I call them enduring problems, because in reality, you never solve this. You never say, boom, process improvement, nailed that, never have to touch that one again. Like it's just something you're always working on. They never go away. Strategic planning, same kind of thing. So I think that these 5 areas are strong indicators of success. Like if you mess up on any particular one of these, you're going to have a really hard time achieving the success that you've set out either for yourself or your team or your company. The other reason I think they're interesting is that they really do appear both in the Civic Center and in companies. So I just grabbed a couple of logos of companies that we work with that I think have great stories. So if you see anybody up here or if you're with one of these companies and you want to know what we did, catch me at the end and I'll tell you the story behind that. But I think it's fantastic that the kind of work that NetApp does around innovation is exactly the same kind of thing that Vienna is doing in Austria to try to inspire companies to be more innovative. using the same set of tools and the same set of principles. So the other reason that I care a lot about this, and there's a ton of really interesting books about this. In fact, I was just at a talk across the hall, a half an hour ago, talking about, some motivations and how people behave and, what gets people going. A lot of the books that talk about that touch upon the things that Paul Nutt mentions as well. But it's like, in general, why do strategic decisions fail? Right? And what he says is essentially you're not talking to the right people, you're not casting a wide enough net, right? You're not including the right stakeholders. The three in the middle, I think, are really interesting. You're not organizing the conversation correctly, so you're not considering the right items to make a decision in the first place. So you got the wrong people and the wrong mental model or the wrong framework, and then it's not collaborative, right? So 50% fail because of these reasons. So the book is interesting. All right, so before we get into how do you address those things, I just want to make a distinction between communication and collaboration. This is communication, right? It tends to be one to many. And there's a ton of fantastic communication tools out there, and I love a lot of them, right? The web conferencing, the wikis, the SharePoints, I mean, the list is huge, and I think as an industry in general, we've gotten really good at that. But that's not collaboration, right? You can't collaborate with 1,000 people. Human cognition kind of cuts off collaboration at right around 8 or 9 people. You might be able to do it with 10 or 11, depending on how well the people know each other. But for the most part, your brain starts to say no after you have to listen to 7 other people. So if you want to collaborate with 1,000 people, you're going to have a different way of doing that. And that's what I want to talk about today. Frameworks. So kind of in essence, what we're saying at Contenio is that the tool for collaboration is a framework. It's not WebEx, it's not a Google Doc. Those things don't foster collaboration, they foster communication. All right, so what's a framework? You use them all the time now, right? We're just putting a really formal name to them. So for those of you who are familiar with design thinking, that's a composable framework. If you unwrap that, you'll realize it's really a whole bunch of little frameworks that all make up design thinking. Value proposition canvas is another one. For developers in the room, Agile. Right? Scrum is a framework for doing Agile. So any business book, any Harvard Business Review that you read will have probably 2 or 3 frameworks in it. It's the images that you see that helps you make sense of information that is just overloading otherwise. Right? So that's a framework. So we're intentional about using them. And the reason why I think they're so powerful is that they will help you in all areas of the organization that you're working in. Some are incredibly tactical. Right, if you're a Scrum team, you do your retrospective every release or every couple releases every 2 to 4 weeks, very tactical. Right, if you're in the strategic planning organization and you're looking at a time horizon of 12 months or 2 years or whatever yours might be, you're not going to be doing strategic planning every month. If you are, you're doing something wrong, right? Strategic planning isn't a weekly or monthly thing. So there's, episodically and by role, there are frameworks that are really honed to help these people. And the reason why they work so well is, if you think about any actually take games, for example. We base a lot of how we organize the interaction in a framework around game theory and game mechanics, right? If you know what the goal is and you know what the rules of interaction are with your other people, anybody can learn how to play Monopoly or chess or football or soccer, right? If you show me a soccer pitch and you don't tell me what the rules are, I'm gonna have no idea what's going on just by looking at it, and I will have 0 idea how to interact with the other people, right? But you don't have to give me very much to know, oh, now I get it, I can do this. I might not be good at it, but at least I know what I'm supposed to be doing. Frameworks are the same kind of way. They have a goal, they have interaction rules between people, and humans are compelled to play by the rules, are compelled to follow the agreements. So a framework is really just essentially giving people a way to interact with each other that everybody agrees on so you can stay on topic, make decisions faster, get to work faster, right? So frameworks are great. The other thing that I like about frameworks is that they span the whole decision-making process. So what I want you to think about is it's not just about generating ideas. I think there's a lot in the industry from other vendors that really kind of pound on that idea generation side of things. But if you're not thinking about how the frameworks all fit together to the point where you're taking action, I know a lot of people kind of start to complain about idea generating frameworks. Like, I have so many ideas, I don't know what to do with them. I don't need any more new ideas, right? So if we're talking about frameworks for new ideas, I'm not interested anymore, I have too many. So what we're trying to do at Contenio is curate, design, and help our customers design frameworks that span this entire time frame. Sure, sometimes you do need new ideas, but oftentimes your biggest problem is around prioritization. So that's what we're going to help you do. We're about to switch gears here. I'm going to give you a framework that I think you're going to find really useful if you take this back with teams. And the reason that I picked it is that it spans almost the entire, from idea all the way down to taking action, depending on how you want to tailor it. So it's a super versatile framework that provides very clear interaction rules and can produce some really fantastic results for your team. Okay, so planning wall, what is it? It probably looks like something you do anyway, right? Like you might accidentally do a planning wall. So we're all about, well, instead of accidentally doing it, let's make it intentional. So the most important part of the planning wall is it's based on an XY axis where you have an effort axis, like how much effort is this going to take? Sometimes it's translated into what's the cost of doing this thing going to be. It might be actual dollars, it could be time, it could be a combination of those two things, but there's something around effort. And then the other axis is about value. How important is this either to my customer, to the market, to the success of us as a company? So it's really interesting if you start looking at things like projects or programs or features in a product or basically anything where you have more opportunity than you have resources. Having people work together to figure this out is a really powerful way of aligning around what we're going to do. What are we going to do next and why are we going to do it? What we look at here is, okay, well, you can start to then segment out results based on where they're placed, right? So where a Post-it note ends up is super important. I actually think the process of how it got there is super important too, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But the end result is, what are we going to do, right? So there was, 15, 20 Post-it notes up there, but we're only going to do 6. How did we get there? And are we all clear? And are we all aligned? And are we all bought into that? So let me give you some examples of ways you can think about using planning wall. We have some salespeople in the room. So we've done this actually with Cisco. The idea here was Cisco wanted to implement a sales enablement program, improve the way they support their salespeople in the field. So their question was, how are we going to understand what we're going to do for you when we have way more requests and opportunities and we have no idea about where the value is going to come from, right? So what prevents you from selling bigger deals faster? Where's the value and how much effort would it take for you to implement something like this? So when you start casting a wider net and including more people in this conversation, you end up not just making a better decision, but the skin in the game. I don't know, who was at the talk about how you incent salespeople? Was anyone in that talk? It was great. You need to look at the download of the slide deck there. But the idea is when you can give people some skin in the game, they feel much more invested in making it successful. If you never ask anybody, it's like, sure, I'm supposed to care about the success of my company, but no one ever even asked me. So the kind of skin in the game I have there is more tied to I want to keep my job and I want my paycheck, right? But if you pull me into the conversation and my voice has the ability to be heard and kind of be recorded, then all of a sudden I care deeply about whether this thing is going to be successful or not, because I was part of it. It's kind of like my baby, right? So, who are you going to bring into this? And what are you going to be doing, and why are you doing it? These are things that you need to be really clear on, and it's also you have to be clear to your people about why am I inviting you to planning wall. These are questions you're going to have to tell them. Another element of using the planning wall, once you're clear on who you need to invite and why you're going to do it and what the purpose is, what the outcome is, okay, well, tell me a little bit, think through what's the scale of this. Is it 8 people? Is it, in the case of Cisco, they invited 1,000. 1,000 of their global sales force. Now, not all 1,000 participated. I think it was more like 300, 350, but 1,000 were invited. Totally different scale, right? So if you have 8 people, you could probably do it in a room with a whiteboard. You have 1,000 people, you need a platform for that. Right, so you have to think that through. What are you going to do with the data? Where is it going to come from? Who needs to be there? Are you going to do it online or not? Are you going to have facilitators to help or not? That's part of the planning of using planning wall. All right, so the next thing you have to think about with what appears to be a relatively simple grid, an XY axis, is how are we going to start tailoring what it means when people place a Post-it note in a particular point? So you can see, on the top, you might be thinking about value as high, medium, low value. Maybe you want to get a little bit more specific. Maybe you want to start attaching dollar amounts to that. So it's up to you, but it makes a huge difference to the people who are going to participate about how they're going to answer the question for you. So for us, we'll often do a first pass at low, medium, high. We just want a t-shirt size stuff, right? We want to get alignment around that. But later on in the process, we might actually start putting real dollar amounts towards things because we start to understand more about them and we can actually do that. So it's a decision you need to make. The other thing that's important is to decide, do you want to make the spots equal or do you want to make them unequal? So what I'm implying here on this bottom part, I wish I had a pointer, but it's the box on the lower right. If my low, if my low value stuff is small, right, there's a small little bar and the high value stuff is much bigger, I just made like a little cognitive suggestion to people, which is I'm not so interested in the low stuff. We're not going to really focus there. Yes, there's a space for it, but I'm really looking for the high value things. That changes the conversations that people have. It changes the way they interact with it. And you may or may not want that. So you have to be conscious about that. Okay, same thing with effort. It could be small, medium, and large, right? Or you might start looking at story points, right? Maybe the content that you're working with, you already understand the yardstick that you want to be using to measure that. And so maybe small, medium, and large is no longer what you need to use. All right, and then the last thing you have to figure out is how are we going to decide what the do this space is? Like if we have this grid and we're going to put a bunch of Post-it notes on there, at the end of the day, how do we know which stuff do we want to do? That's up to you, right? So it changes all the time, and it depends on resources, it depends on time frame. If you're looking at what can we do this month, it's different than what can we do this quarter. So that's something you have to make a decision on. All right, last thing is interaction design. So if you have 8 people in a room, you still have to think about, do I want them all to come together at the same time, work together, and when we're done, they leave and that's it? Do I want them to work on it individually, then come together to work on it, and then maybe even leave and work individually again? That's okay. Do I want them to take turns, right? So each person puts all their stuff and interacts, and maybe it's over the course of a week rather than a course of a day. So how you ask people to collaborate together makes a difference on the content that you get, how long it takes, and also how much sharing that they've done to create a shared understanding or shared mental model. So one of the things I'd suggest is turn-taking is great. This is my personal opinion here. Turn-taking is great, but if that's all you're going to do, you might as well have done a survey. Right? So turn-taking probably has a point in the interaction that you're designing, but there has to be a point where you're going to leverage the collaboration and the discussions, and having all, say, 8 people come together is super valuable, especially when you're doing this with a cross-functional team. All right, so any questions so far? I'm going to switch to the case study that I want to talk about how we did this at Contenio, and that might answer some of them, but any questions so far? All right, let me stop me if you have some, but I'm going to go and talk about how we do this at Contenio. So one of our customers is the Tailoring Foundation. Really fabulous customer. They have a mission that especially now I hold very dear. They study how democracy works. And they're a very well-funded, through an endowment nonprofit. And they work at the national level on national issues. And their mission is to identify where there is common ground on issues that are very controversial and give that information to policymakers so that policymakers in theory can create legislation and policy that tap into common ground and can start to ignore right-left arguments and labels around Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, that kind of thing. They're looking for common ground. So we have an ongoing relationship with them. I'm the account manager, so I'm the salesperson for this account. And I have a need to stay very tied to what they're doing and what their plans are and what their strategy is. Now, they move a little slower than some of my corporate partners because they have a revenue stream that is very stable and they understand it very well. But I still need to know how can we start to nudge them more towards what the digital online world is and have them embrace that, right? That's what they want to do, and that's what I want to help them do. So what we wanted to do with them is, okay, well, let's use Planning Wall to plan out the next chunk of work that we need to do. And I wanted to be part of that because they hadn't paid for it yet. Right? I needed to build a proposal after this. So I was very motivated to be part of this, to kind of listen to my customer and understand what they're trying to do, but also to help them with this exercise. So here's kind of what it looked like. Our product owner had a backlog item of about 40 things that Kettering Foundation wanted us to add into the platform that we built for them. And he had a sort of an idea, pretty good one in some cases, about where they would fit on Planning Wall. So, he had a guess, right? But what we decided to do is instead of pre-populating the Planning Wall with his guesses, we left it empty. We left it blank. And we did this online because they're based in Denver. I live in Oakland. My office is in Sunnyvale, and I might as well be in Denver if I have to get to my office in Sunnyvale. So we used our platform called Weave to do this. And one at a time, our product owner would say, okay, here's a Post-it note of a chunk of functionality, and Kettering Foundation would manage the value. How important is this to you? So they only got to deal with one access, right? Now, my CTO was involved in this as well, and he got to control the effort. Do you know how fascinating the conversations were when you started to get 2 or 3 or 4 things on here, and the effort was controlled by actually the customer, which is where it should be. I got to be sometimes a customer advocate for that. And then relative to the other things that were going up, my CTO would be saying things like, oh, that's easy, or that's hard, or that's going to take a really long time, or there's some things we need to do first before we can even get to that. Right? So by the time all 40 things got on here, and it took about 2.5 hours to go through this, we were all exhausted for sure. But I can't tell you how well I knew what they were doing for the next 6 months. Like, I could tell you a story about each one of those Post-it notes and why they felt it was either high or low value, or how it tied into their strategic objectives. Dan felt awesome, our CTO, because no one was dictating things to him. He got to be part of the conversation about prioritization, so he was totally bought in to, how things should roll out, right? And he also heard from the customer about why something was important. So he was like, it was his baby too now. I mean, it wasn't just the customer's baby. So in terms of how we tailored it, this is the background tailoring regions. It's kind of like geofencing. We tailored it based on, very high all the way down to very low. We decided to use 5 instead of 3. The small, medium, large, that's Dan's section. And then which are we going to do first, second, and third, right? So our do it first is how we ended up. That's the proposal, right? That's the proposal that I built, was the do it first. So I just thought I'd give you the quick little story. Each one of these Post-it notes had a story behind it. The fixed double negative, I just picked that because it was up near the corner, but it started out, in the high priority area. And there was some discussion about, well, what is this thing, and do we need to do it, and what does fixed double negative mean? I didn't even know what this was, right? It just turned out to be a linguistic problem that was incredibly tricky for this platform that we built for Kettering Foundation. So we got to discuss linguistics a little bit. So then Amy, who's with the Kettering Foundation, she moved it to do it first, but kind of a medium priority. So it moved behind that column. And then more discussion. Dan decided that he had to move it to a small. It was easy, not hard to do this. And then Mike moved it up to really high priority. We need to do this first. So there was this evolution of the idea that we got to track, and the platform we used captures all that. So I can go back at any point in time and say, how did we end up with this being something we need to do? Right, it's all there. It's we download this stuff into a report, right? So we started out with our list of 40 things. We pumped it into the Planning Wall framework. We had a cross-functional team. There was about 6 of us on that work. And at the end, we had our stuff about do first. We pumped it out into a spreadsheet. I used it for the proposal. And I could use my customers' words in my proposal, right, about how we were going to do this. And they already knew how much it was going to cost, kind of emotionally, because they heard Dan talk about how complex something was going to be or how simple something was going to be. Fastest proposal I ever had signed. They did the work, right? I just had to sit there for 2.5 hours and kind of learn from them and learn from my CTO. But basically, they did the work on this one. So that's my case study story. I think what I want you to take away from this is frameworks could be really complex. They could be Scrum, they could be design thinking, they could be something that you probably have to read a whole book about to understand it. But Planning Wall is not complex, right? You don't even need my software to do this, right? Weave is great because you can do it at scale, you can do it with distributed teams. But what I want to leave you guys with is there's a landing page you can go to if you want to download a printable version of the Planning Wall. So if you go there, it's a PDF that'll print 3 feet by 5 feet, or you can just copy it and put it on a whiteboard. All you need is a whiteboard and a stack of Post-it notes. So the setup is really up to you. Do you want, if you don't give anybody a pre-printed Post-it note, if it's just totally blank canvas, it's an ideation framework. You're asking for new ideas. If you're like my product manager, he had all the 40 of them already defined ahead of time. So then it was more of a shaping. We were trying to figure out what's important and why, and what might be first and what might be second. You could even be more rigid than that and have them put on the planning wall already done and say, okay, all you're allowed to do is fix it. You can't put any new ideas on there. If you move something, you have to justify it. If you can't justify it, you can't move it. Right? It's all, so you start to, by adding a few more rules and modding the game a little bit, you start to move it from ideation oriented down to pretty rigid prioritization. So it's super easy to use. You don't need a lot of gear. You can do it online. You can do it. On that landing page, it'll show you how to do it online. Or you can do it with a big, giant poster print. You can do it with 8 people, and if you want to go with 500 people, you just have to use the online platform, which will kind of organize them into their groups of 8 for you. But that's essentially the planning wall story and the use case behind how we did it. So I have, I think, about 3 minutes left, so that's plenty of time for questions if anyone has them.
Questions for Laura?
So it's interesting what you just mentioned, right? Prioritization and making sure that things are executed in the sequence you want. The question that I had was the cost component. You said your CTO commented on the cost. Now, most of the time when you are having different functional areas coming together and putting their requests, right? Initially, there is only certain idea that you may have about the cost.
Right.
You wouldn't know the exact cost of a certain initiative until you get to maybe the SOW, right? Mm-hmm. I guess, how did you manage that? Because, I mean, you're prioritizing now based on, oh, this is going to cost me this much. But then it may just not cost you that much.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In this particular case, our product owner had the list of items ahead of time, the 40, they weren't new. So our engineering department had already done a first pass at complexity. But I wasn't part of that. Our customer certainly wasn't part of that. So there were a few surprises for my product owner, because the other thing that engineers will tell you all the time is, if there's a high risk, it means they don't know very much about it. It's expensive to do it. And after they start investigating it, they may realize that it's the simplest thing ever, right? There's a library that helps us do this practically out of the box, right? We don't have to build it from scratch. So there can be some wild swings on cost, and there was probably 1 or 2 examples like that where Dan said, oh, I thought it was going to be hard, but it's really easy. It's a simple one. And other times you dig into it, you thought it was going to be easy, and then you realize, oh my God, it's a data model change, right? It sounds simple. Everyone thinks it's going to be easy, but I have to touch the data model in order to even implement it. It's extra large. So in this case, we had a pre-understanding. My CTO wasn't blindsided by this. If it's brand new ideas, I still think that a good engineering team, and you may want more than 1 person at that point, can at least t-shirt size things, right? That sounds small, sounds medium, but when you're vague about it like that, you're leaving room open for honing of your answer, right? Or if you're asking them for story points or how many sprints or exact numbers of person hours, okay, they're not going to like that, and you're going to end up shifting things. So you have to know, is it a small, medium, large, or can I actually get down to budget dollars?
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
I'm Sean. Laura, I'd like to know how often you find complex sales teams using this for each deal, or do they get to the point where they've kind of sussed out what a deal type looks like because of this, or what does it look like from the sales perspective?
There's 2 sales examples that I think are interesting. One of them is internal, and this is sales engineering and salespeople deciding where sales engineer time should be spent. And sales engineers, are a scarce resource, and so that's an internal sales planning thing. NetApp has a fantastic story though about external, and so, and I think the guy who designed it at NetApp has a talk about it on the internet somewhere, so I should dig that up. But what they did was they co-created the proposal. NetApp incorporates a bunch of other products into a deal, right? And so they go to their biggest customers, their billion-dollar customers, and they use collaboration frameworks in order to bring together, say, Microsoft and some of the other people that they bring together to create this deal. So not just the customer understands what they want and what they're trying to get, but the other partners are also aligned and come together on how are we going to organize this deal so that we're all happy and the customer gets what they want. So they don't use the platform for that. They've done it in person. And they just have a cocktail of these are the things we know we're going to go through with our customer and our partners. And usually it's an all-day meeting. And everyone knows going in that the outcome of that meeting is a proposal, or at least like the working pieces of the proposal, so that everyone goes back and then builds their part. So what's nice about that is there's no socialization time afterwards. They don't have to like explain it and justify it and try to convince somebody at Microsoft that this is a really good thing. The Microsoft guy was there, right? So it speeds things up. Any other questions? I have 30 seconds left. Yes. Uh-huh.
So you kind of alluded to the fact that there may be a third dimension from time to time, which could be sequencing or it could be something else. So do you have any cliff notes around where you can go if you're kind of like out of dimensions, you know, if you want to add something else? Sequencing, I think, was one you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So they'll come up, you can put them in all those orders, but you may have a dependency that's kind of like way off the list, but you actually have to do it first.
Yeah, so I have a couple answers to that. I think it's a great question. One of them is, it's pretty rare that we're involved in a project where one single framework is enough, right? So oftentimes the way you get at and tease out some of the complexities that you're getting at is it's 2 or 3 frameworks, maybe not even on the same day. It might be over the course of a week or a month. Okay, that's one answer. Another one would be some intentional modding. So one of my favorite ones is, you know, if you're looking for some really out-of-the-box thinking, some crazy idea, and all you have to work with is Post-it notes, and you say, okay, let's come up with some really great ideas. People are scared to be really crazy in front of them and come up with a really off-the-wall idea, right? So all you have to do is like tweak the rules a little bit and say, okay, we have these regular Post-it notes, and I have bananas. And use the Post-it notes for your ideas, but if you have a really wacky one, write it on the banana instead of the Post-it note. And all of a sudden, you've given permission to people to really put a risky thing up there because, hey, it's a banana. If it's a dumb idea, who cares? And so that you can do things like that to kind of tease out something that would be maybe unexpected and risky just by switching the rule a little bit, and people will then be willing to take a risk. All right, I just think you guys are fantastic for being, you know, here when it's the last talk of the day, so thank you very much.
Yes, everybody, let's thank Laura for sharing.